Hey everyone, it's Paul from One Cast, One Fish, and today we're back with the Evinrude ETEC. Today we're going to be replacing components from our fuel tank all the way to our motor. But first, we got a little bit of prep work. And that's because our fuel tank is located underneath the floor. And under here is where the fuel tank is, but first we're going to have to undo all of these screws and pull up this plate. With all those screws loose, our floor panel should lift right out, revealing our fuel tank. And now we have free access to the tank and the components we'll be replacing, such as this integrated fuel flow valve. The first thing I'll be doing is removing the integrated fuel flow valve, and this is held in with a clip that you have to remove. When I pull this integrated fuel valve out, chances are there's going to be fuel that leaks, so I'm going to want to have some rags ready just to get any of that fuel, along with a catch tub. With our valve removed, now we're going to want to clean up any mess and fuel that's spilled. Now we're going to remove the hose clamp so we can disconnect the fuel hose from our integrated flow valve. Now again, once we remove this hose, chances are we're going to have fuel that flows back from this hose, so we want to keep our rags in place and be prepared with our catch basin. And now we're going to start disconnecting things on the motor side of our fuel system. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this out a little bit to give ourselves some working room, so that way there we can disconnect the primer bulb. And in my case, our fuel line is attached to the primer bulb by a worm gear clamp. Alright, once that's loose, we're going to disconnect this fuel line and catch any of the fuel that runs out. And as you get close, be ready because I expect some fuel to come out. Yep, just a little bit there. With our primer bulb disconnected, I'm going to remove the fuel hose from the motor itself, right here. I can't stress it enough, make sure you have that rag there to catch any fuel, along with a cup or something. And again, this is going to be held on by another one of those worm gear clamps. Now in my case, these are a little tough because it's been 10 years that these lines have been on here, but they're coming loose. And again, catch that fuel right there in our cup. With our system disconnected, it's time to have a little talk about components. And in our case, we're going to be replacing our integrated fuel flow valve, anti-siphon valve, fuel primer bulb, and of course our fuel hose. One thing I want you to notice is with all these components, and I feel it's extremely important, is that you'll see these are all OEM Evinrude parts. And I highly recommend you replace yours with the same. But do what you want. But don't come back here in the comment section asking questions why your Walmart fuel primer bulb failed. Now I want to come back and talk about fuel hose a little bit more, as getting the correct types is going to be very important. From our fuel tank to our primer bulb, we're going to be using Shield Series 368 fuel feed line. This line's EPA compliant and US Coast Guard type A1-15. And this is going to be important because this type of fuel line is designed and required for anything below deck. And it's not cheap. Anywhere from $8 to $10 a foot. Our next fuel line from the primer bulb to the motor is going to be SAE J30R9. The R9 fuel hose is going to be more flexible and acceptable to use above deck. We're going to have to snake our new fuel line up through the boat and to the motor. But I'm going to show you a little trick that I use to make that easier. What I'm going to do is take our new fuel line and our old fuel line, and I'm just going to tie them together here with some duct tape, so that way I can just pull the new line in as I pull the old line out. Alright, we just about got it. There's our new fuel hose coming out. Now we're going to take the tape measure and measure this old hose and see how many feet it is. Alright, so we're looking at roughly about 5 feet for our old hose. Now our new hose was 9 feet long, so I'm going to measure out 4 feet and cut the hose. Now before we cut this expensive fuel line, double check your measure and give yourself a couple more inches just in case. Now we're going to attach our primer bulb, but there's one thing I want to point out. You'll notice here that there's an arrow indicating the way the fuel is supposed to flow through the check valve. So make sure that arrow is pointed towards your engine. We're going to start by placing that worm gear clamp over our hose. Then we're going to take our fuel primer bulb, and we want to double check the arrow to make sure it's pointing toward the motor in the correct direction. And we're simply going to slide it onto our hose. And you want to make sure it's pressed all the way firmly against it. Now we can tighten our clamp. And now we're going to move back down to the fuel tank. First order of business at the fuel tank is going to be setting up that integrated fuel valve and our anti-siphon valve. And in my case, it's pretty simple because it screws right in. The important thing is that you're careful because you don't want to cross thread it. Once that anti-siphon valve's tightened down, I'm going to show you another little trick, and that's with some triple guard grease. What we're going to do is there's a small O-ring right here that you can barely see. We're going to smear a little bit of triple guard grease on that O-ring just to make it seat a little bit easier. First thing I'm going to do is get that worm gear clamp and slide it over our fuel hose. And we're going to attach our integrated fuel valve to our hose first, and then we're going to place it onto the fuel tank. Once we get everything flush, we're going to tighten down on our clamp. With our clamp tight, I'm going to clean up any fuel residue that's down here before we seat this valve. And once we're ready, we're simply going to press it into the fuel tank. And you should hear that click. Now that doesn't mean we're done. Remember earlier our clip that we pulled out? We're going to reinstall this clip. And that's going to hold our valve in place. And that'll take care of our line replacement here at the tank. Now we're ready to finish up by attaching our hose from our primer bulb to our motor fitting. Here's our old hose, and all I'm going to do is measure out on our new hose and cut it to length. Now we'll press our new fuel line onto our primer bulb, making sure it's seated all the way. And we're going to slide on both of our worm gear clamps and tighten this one down at our fuel primer bulb. Now if you're wondering why we didn't attach our other end to the motor yet, that's because I want to use the primer bulb and I want to pump fresh gas through our hose to eliminate some of the air, but also get anything that may be in the hose to come out. We don't want contaminated fuel going into our motor. And it may take a little bit to get the first fuel to flow. And it doesn't take a lot, just enough to flush it through. We're going to simply press our fuel line onto our motor connection. And once that connection is tight, we're going to tighten our worm gear clamp. Now it's time for one of the most important parts. We're going to let everything sit pressurized overnight and check for leaks in the morning. So at this point, we're sitting at 24 hours almost with fuel in the systems on our new fuel lines and fuel components for our Evinrude ETEC. Which means now we want to take and double check everything and make sure there's no leaks. Which is a pretty simple process. I'm going to check and feel around on our integrated fuel valve here, check our fittings where we attached everything, make sure there's no wetness or leaks. Now we're going to move to the fuel primer bulb, checking for any leaks or wetness at our fittings and attachment points. And we want to make sure that primer bulb is still firm. And our final fitting is the one where it goes into the motor, and we're just checking for any leakage. Hopefully, like me, you had no leaks in your newly installed fuel system. But before we start to clean up and button everything back up, there's a few more things that we're going to want to do. That's going to start right here with our key switch. We're going to turn our motor to the on position. Don't start your motor, just turn it to the on position to prime the fuel system and start the fuel pump. And you should be able to hear that fuel pump start to prime once you've turned the key to the on position. And you're going to want to do that 2 to 3 times. With our fuel system primed, now we're going to double check our primer bulb to make sure it's still firm. I hope this video has helped you feel more confident and comfortable tackling replacing the fuel system and components in your boat for your Evinrude ETEC. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to ask down in the comments section below. And don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button on your way out. And we'll see you next time on the water.